Welcome to What is a Lutheran with Pastor Fred here at St. James Lutheran Church in Marion, Indiana. And we are continuing our road to Jesus this week. Today we are covering Genesis chapter 25 through Genesis chapter 42 for the week of January 8th through January 15th. Remember last week that Abraham had been promised descendants as numerous as the stars. So how is that going right now? Well, one, Isaac. Not so good. God kind of has his own timing, we're going to find out. So chapter 24 last week ended with the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah. Chapter 25 begins with Abraham's death. The next thing we see is the birth of Esau and Jacob, sons of Isaac and Rebekah, and they are twins. But Esau is the firstborn with all rights and privileges pertaining. Esau, though, did not value that blessing, and so he sold it to Jacob for some lentil soup when he was hungry, showing that his stomach was his real god. Now, I love lentil soup, but that's a pretty high price to pay for it. It also shows that Jacob is willing to do anything to get something that doesn't necessarily belong to him. It doesn't stop there, though. Many years later, as Isaac is dying, he calls for Esau and tells him to bring him some grain to eat so he can give him the firstborn's blessing. Rebekah overhears this, and she, of course, likes Jacob more than Esau, and she convinces Jacob that it's time to steal the birthright permanently from Esau. You just have to love the family dynamics here, right? It just shows us that God's people are sinners, just like everyone else, and that if it wasn't for God's grace, well, none of them and none of us would have ever made it. So while his brother Esau is out hunting game, Jacob goes and gets a couple goats from the field, and his mother cooks them and puts the skins from the goats on Jacob, who is in scripture described as a smooth-skinned man. And so his father will think he's Esau, who's described as a hairy man. Isaac is blind, so he can't actually see what son it is. And so Jacob lies and says he's Esau. And so Isaac gives Jacob the firstborn son's blessings. Esau comes back and finds out he has been cheated, and he determines that once Isaac dies, he's going to kill Jacob. Now, if you're reading the Bible for the first time, you're thinking, oh, I didn't think it was going to go this way. This is a horrible, immoral story. Yep. Welcome to the story of God saving immoral, sinful, horrible people from their sins. That's what it's all about. If this road isn't going to Jesus, nobody in Scripture, including any of us, will make it to heaven. Rebekah realizes that Jacob is now in danger, and so she convinces Isaac to send him back to her family, who lives far away in another land, to find a wife. On the way there, Jacob has a dream where he sees a ladder going to heaven and angels going up and down on it. And God promises here that he will be with Jacob through thick and thin, and that he will bring him back home eventually. God basically gives Jacob a sign that everything's going to be all right. And Jacob's going to need that for what's coming right in front of him. Jacob ends up at his relative Laban's house, who ends up being even more of a deceiver and a cheat than Jacob is. Jacob is there for a couple decades, serving Laban for the right to marry his daughters. Laban continually changes the terms of his employment and seems to always get the best of Jacob. Jacob wants to marry Rachel, but instead Laban tricks him into marrying her sister Leah. And then Laban makes a deal where if Jacob will agree to him to work for 7 more years, he will give him Rachel as well. This whole section of the Bible could be labeled the D section for deception. During this time, Jacob has 12 sons that eventually become the founders of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, interestingly enough, we see that Jacob loves Rachel, not Leah. But knowing that Jesus was eventually to come from the tribe of Judah, who is Judah's mother? Leah. God seems to spend a lot of time giving barren women children and giving unloved men and women his blessings and his gifts. Well, Jacob becomes very prosperous in the midst of all this and eventually manages to outwit or outdeceive Laban. It all comes to a head in chapter 31 when Jacob realizes he's getting nowhere with Laban and decides to flee back to his homeland with his wives, his children, all his flocks. Well, it doesn't take long for Laban to figure out what's happened, and he catches up with Jacob out in the desert. But before he can do anything, God intervenes and makes cooler heads prevail. This is again part of God's fulfilling of his promise to Jacob at the whole ladder scene that he would eventually bring him back to the homeland. Laban demands his household gods back, and it's here that we see Rachel's learned a few things that her dad Laban and her husband Jacob have apparently taught her. She is the one who stole the gods, but she hides them from her father so he can't find them. Apparently, a family that deceives together stays together. But don't worry, because God himself is going to make them get rid of those gods later on before they get home. Jacob has one more problem, though, and it's a big problem. It's his brother Esau. Remember, Esau wanted to kill him when he left a couple decades ago. So he sends Esau all kinds of gifts to buy him off. I mean, he had bought his birthright from Esau, so he knew Esau could be bought. When they eventually meet him, though, he finds out that Esau has forgiven him. The brothers are united again and end up burying their father together. Right before this, though, as Jacob is struggling with the thought of dealing with Esau, he wrestles with a man who turns out to be none other than the angel of the Lord, which of course we know is the Son of God. So Jacob wrestles with the pre-incarnate Jesus, the Messiah without flesh. The Son of God blesses Jacob and changes his name to Israel, while at the same time putting his hip socket out of joint. After this, we come to a very unfortunate event, and that is the rape of Jacob's daughter Dinah by Shechem. When Israel and his sons find out about this, they are rightly mad. But Shechem's father intervenes and says, hey, let's make a covenant together so we can share the land and marry into each other's families. Now, remember for a minute that God does not want his people marrying into foreign tribes who worship foreign gods, which would lead the people Israel astray. So this should have been a no from the beginning. And hey, bring Shechem out here because he has to pay the penalty for what he did to our sister. But they have other plans to exact revenge. And so Isaac's sons say, well, we could do that, Jacob's sons say, we could do that if all the males in your group get circumcised. And Shechem and his father and all the men in their people group see this as a great opportunity to gain all kinds of economic wealth from the Israelites, and so they get circumcised. But as they are recovering, Israel's sons, Simeon and Levi, invade their camp and kill all the males and plunder their entire nation. Israel reacts to this by saying, you have made us an enemy of all these people, and they are much bigger than us. And later he includes a curse on them in his blessing before he dies. The whole event is sordid, but it is a story of God's people. The story continues with the story of Joseph, which is one of the most amazing stories in all of Scripture. Joseph is the 11th son of Israel and the first son of Rebekah, remember the wife he loved. Joseph has several dreams that show his brothers and even his father bowing down to him. Joseph, unfortunately, also has no problem sharing those dreams with his older brothers, which does nothing but make them despise him. Adding to that, Israel makes him a coat of many colors, clearly revealing his status as a favorite son. This just makes his brothers hate him more. It all comes to a head when his brothers sell him into slavery, and he gets taken to Egypt, and his brothers tell their father that a wild animal ate him. I mean, talk about some sibling rivalry. This is way beyond, Daddy's touching me, he's looking at me. So hey, if your brother or sister picked on you when you were younger, well, at least they didn't sell you into slavery, right? Well, just as we get into the story, God interrupts it with an entirely different story. Don't you hate it when that happens? Chapter 38, he begins to tell a story about Judah, who was the leading advocate, remember, for selling Joseph into slavery. And let's just say this story doesn't portray Judah in the best light. And remember, Judah is who Jesus will eventually descend from, just in case you thought you had some crazy relatives. Judah, it seems, had a son who married a woman by the name of Tamar, and he died. And so the next son married her, and well, he died. So when it came time for the third son to marry her, well, Judah decided to give that son a different wife. I guess he thought Tamar was bad luck. The fact of the matter is, his two earlier sons were just flat evil. Well, Tamar sees this, and she dresses up like a prostitute and sits beside the road. Judah, passing by her and not knowing it's his daughter-in-law, pays her to sleep with him, and she becomes pregnant. Upon hearing that Tamar is pregnant, Judah orders that she be brought out and killed for committing adultery. It then comes to light that he's the one she committed adultery with, and the baby is his. Oops, my bad. She ends up having twins. One of them she names Perez. And yes, you probably guessed it, he ends up becoming an ancestor of Jesus. Yeah, think about that one for a minute. The descendant of Judah, who will become an ancestor of Jesus, is a result of Judah sleeping with his daughter-in-law. Proof that no matter what, God takes the bad and turns it into something good. God works through people, sinful people. The Pharisees would later ask Jesus why he eats with sinners. Well, he could have said, because I like to eat with family. Right after this, we return to Joseph and we find him in Egypt, where Potiphar's wife is trying to seduce him. Cue the soap opera music because it's beginning to sound like one. He, of course, says no, and she accuses him of doing what she wanted him to do, and she is believed, and he is thrown into prison to rot. But Joseph is one of those guys who can fall into a pile of manure and come out smelling like roses. In prison, he's put in charge of everything, and he interprets 2 dreams of Pharaoh's servants. Both of them become true. Eventually, his talents come out, and he is brought to Pharaoh to interpret a dream that he had. It is here we begin to see why God has orchestrated Joseph being brought into Egypt. Joseph tells Pharaoh that his dreams indicate that Egypt is going to have 7 years of good crops and 7 years of bad, and therefore Pharaoh needs to put some really smart guy in charge who can figure out how to save up as much grain as possible during the first 7 years so that there'll be grain for the last 7 years. Pharaoh says, okay, you're in charge. And things happen just the way Joseph said they would. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, back with Israel and his other 11 sons, they're starting to feel the effects of the famine. And so Israel sends some of the brothers to Egypt to get grain. And well, that is where our story ends this week. But come back next week because it really gets exciting as we get to know this Pharaoh and a number of pharaohs after him. So join us next week in Egypt. Thank you for joining us for the Road to Jesus for What is a Lutheran here at St. James Lutheran Church in Marion, Indiana. It's Pastor Fred. Peace out.